Hello, how are you? Hope you're well. Okay, we have the six of spades now. Um, and I can't remember anything about the book, so it's all a revelation to me. But did you remember that Hans's grandfather was called Ludwig? And the letter is from, or the letter is written by, that he's reading, the miniature one with this magnifying glass, is called Ludwig. So the mystery starts to materialise. Okay, six of spades. I was just about to fall asleep over the magnifying glass and the sticky bun book. I realised I had read the beginning of a great fairy tale. But it didn't occur to me that this fairy tale had anything to do with me. I tore a piece from the paper bag that the buns had been in and used it as a bookmark. Now, you know this is good, don't you? Because you've always got to use a bookmark. You never turn down the corners of a book. I had once seen something similar to Danielson's bookstore in the Market Square in Arundel. It was a tiny book of fairy tales inside a box. The difference was that this book's writing was so big there wasn't room for more than 15 or 20 words on each page. Of course, this being so, there was no chance of it being a great fairy tale either. It was past 1 in the morning. I put the magnifying glass in one of my jeans pockets and the sticky bum book in the other and dived into bed. Dad woke me up early the next morning. We had to hurry and get back on the road, he said, otherwise we would never make it to Athens in time. He was slightly irritated because I dropped so many sticky bun crumbs on the floor. Crumbs, I thought. So the sticky bum book hadn't been just a dream. I pulled on my jeans and could feel something hard in both pockets. I told Dad that I'd been so hungry in the middle of the night I'd eaten the last sticky bun. I hadn't wanted to turn on any lights, and that's why there were so many crumbs on the floor. We hurriedly packed our things and loaded them into the car before we dashed into the dining room for breakfast. I glanced into the empty restaurant where Ludwig had once sat drinking wine with his friends. After breakfast, we said goodbye to the schooner Waldemar. As we drove past the shops in Waldemarstrasse, Dad pointed to the bakery and asked if that was where I got the buns. I didn't have to answer his question, though, because at that moment the white-haired baker appeared on the steps and waved. He waved at Dad too, and Dad waved back. We were soon back on the highway. I sneaked out the magnifying glass and the sticky bun book from my jeans pockets and started to read. Dad asked me a couple of times what I was doing. First, I said I was checking to see whether there were any fleas or lice in the back seat. But the second time he asked, I said I was thinking of Mama. And this is where he's starting to read his book. Albert sat back in his rocking chair, found some tobacco in an old chest, filled his pipe and lit it. I was born here in Dorf in 1881, he began. I was the youngest of 5 children. That was probably why I was the one most attached to Mother. It was usually in Dorf for boys to stay at home with their mother until they were 7 or 8 years old, but as soon as they turned 8, they joined their fathers at work in the fields and woods. I remember all those long, happy days I walked round the kitchen, hanging on to her skirts. The whole family gathered together only on Sundays, and that's when we would go on our long walks, spend more time eating dinner and play dice games in the evening. Then misfortune fell on our family. When I was 4 years old, Mother was struck down by tuberculosis. We lived with the sickness in our house for many years. Of course, as a little boy, I didn't understand everything, but I remember that Mother was always having to sit down to take a rest, and gradually she was confined to her bed for long periods of time. Sometimes I would sit by her bed and tell her stories I made up myself. I once found her bent over the kitchen bench, having a terrible coughing attack. When I saw that she'd coughed up blood, I went into a terrible rage and started to break everything I found in the kitchen, cups and saucers and glasses, everything I came across. That must have been the first time I realised that she was going to die. I also remember Father coming in to me early one Sunday morning, before the rest of the house had woken up. "Albert," he said, "it is time we talked, because Mother doesn't have long to live." "She's not going to die," I cried in fury. "You're lying." But he wasn't. We had a few more months together, and even though I was only a young boy, I grew used to living with the thought of death long before it arrived. I saw how Mother grew paler and thinner, and how she had a constant fever. I remember the funeral most of all. My two brothers and I had to borrow mourning clothes from friends in the village. I was the only one who didn't cry. I was so angry with Mother for leaving us that I didn't shed a single tear. Since then, I've always thought the best medicine for sorrow is anger. The old man looked up at me as though he knew I was also carrying a great sorrow. "In this way, Father had to support 5 children," he went on. "In the beginning, we managed pretty well. In addition to working on the little farm, Father was the village postmaster. There weren't more than 200 or 300 living in Dorf at that time. My older sister, who was only 13 years old when Mother died, looked after the house. The others helped on the farm, while I, being too small to be useful, went around by myself most of the time. It wasn't uncommon for me to sit by my mother's grave and cry, but I hadn't forgiven her for dying. However, it wasn't long before Father started to drink. At first it was only at the weekends, but it soon became every single day. The postmaster job was the first to go. Then the farm started to fall apart. Both my brothers left for Zurich before they were fully grown men. I continued to wander about on my own. This is still Albert, the baker back then when Ludwig, who is writing the story, because I'm finding it hard to keep up. As I grew older, I was often teased because my father was on the grape, as they called it. If he was found stone drunk in the village, he was sure to be put to bed. I was the one to be punished. I thought I was the one who constantly had to pay for Mother's death. In the end, I found a good friend, Baker Hans. Okay, I'm confused now. Right. He was a white-haired old man who had run the village bakery for a whole generation, but because he had not grown up in Dorf, he was always regarded as a stranger. In addition, he was a quiet man, so no one in the village felt they knew him. These similar names. I'm sure it'll come clear. Baker Hans had been a sailor, but after many years at sea, he had settled down in the village as a baker. On the rare occasions when he walked around the bakery in just his undershirt, he exposed 4 enormous tattoos on his arms. We thought this alone made Baker Hans a bit mysterious, as no other man in Dorf had a tattoo. I particularly remember the tattoo of a woman sitting on a big anchor under which was written Maria. There were many stories about this Maria. Some people said she'd been his sweetheart, but she died of tuberculosis before she was 20 years old. Others said Baker Hans had killed a German woman called Maria, and that's why he'd settled down in Switzerland. Albert seemed to look at me as if he knew that I too had run away from a woman. He doesn't think I've killed her, does he? I thought to myself. But then, he added, there were also some who said Maria was the name of a ship he had sailed on, which had been wrecked somewhere in the great Atlantic Ocean. With that, Albert got up and fetched a big piece of cheese and some bread. He brought out 2 glasses and a bottle of wine. "Am I boring you, Ludwig?" he asked. I shook my head vigorously, and the old baker continued. "Being the orphan I was, I sometimes stood in front of the bakery on Waldemarstrasse. I was often hungry, and I thought it helped my hunger just to look at all the bread and cakes. Then, one day, Baker Hans waved me into the bakery and gave me a big slice of currant cake. From that day on, I had a friend, and this is where my story begins, Ludwig. From then on, I was always visiting Baker Hans. I think he quickly noticed how lonely I was and how I had to take care of myself. If I was hungry, he would give me a piece of freshly baked bread or some cake, and sometimes he opened a fizzy drink. In return, I started to run small errands for him, and before I turned 13 years old, I was a baker's apprentice. But that was after many long years, by which time everything else had come to light, and I had become his son. Father died the same year. He really did drink himself to death. Until the very end, he talked about how he wanted to meet Mother again in heaven. Both my sisters had married far away from Dorf, and I've never heard from my brothers since then. At this point, Albert poured the wine. He walked across to the fireplace and knocked the ash out of his pipe, refilling it with tobacco, and lit it. He blew large, heavy clouds of smoke into the room. Baker Hans and I were companions for each other, and once he was my protector too. 4 or 5 boys started to bully me right outside the bakery. They threw me to the ground and punched me. At least that's how I remember it now. I had learned long before why this kind of thing happened. It was punishment because Mother was dead and Father a drunkard. But that day, Baker Hans came charging out into the street, and I will never forget that sight, Ludwig. He fought to free me and beat every single one of them. Not one escaped without a scratch. He may have been more aggressive than he needed to be, but since that day, none of the people of Dorf have dared to bother me. Well now, this fight was a turning point in my life in more ways than one. Baker Hans dragged me into the shop, brushed off his white coat, and opened a bottle which he placed on the marble counter in front of me. "Drink!" he ordered. I did as he said, and I already felt my score had been settled. "Does it taste good?" he asked, almost before I'd had the chance to swallow the first mouthful of the sweet drink. "Yes, thank you." Pardon me. "But if that tastes good," he continued, almost trembling, "then I promise you that one day I will offer you a drink which is more than 1,000 times better." Of course, I thought he was only joking, but I never forgot his promise. There was something about the way he said it, and something about the situation. His cheeks were still red from what had happened out on the street. Moreover, Baker Hans was no joker. Albert Klausch started to cough and splutter now. I thought he'd got some smoke caught in his throat, but he was just a bit overexcited. He looked across the table at me with a pair of heavy brown eyes. "Are you tired, my boy? Should we continue another evening?" I took another sip of wine and shook my head. "Okay, I was just 12 years old at this time," he said pensively. The days carried on as before, except that nobody dared to lay a hand on me now. I was always dropping in at the baker's. Sometimes we talked together, but now and then he just gave me a piece of cake and sent me on my way. Like everyone else, I discovered that he could be quiet, but he could also tell exciting stories about his life at sea. In this way, I learned about foreign lands. I always visited Baker Hans in his bakery. Otherwise, I would never meet him. However, one cold winter's day, as I sat throwing stones across the frozen Waldemar Sea, he suddenly appeared beside me. "You're growing up, Albert," he said simply. I'm going to be 13 in February, I replied. It'll do. Tell me, do you think you're big enough to keep a secret? I'll keep all the secrets you tell me until I die. I thought so, and that's important, my boy, because I don't think that I have that long to live. Oh, yes, you do, I said at once. You have loads of time. Suddenly, I felt as cold as the snow and ice around me. It was the second time in my young life that I had been given news of a death. He took no notice of my words. Instead, he said, "You know where I live, Albert, and I would like you to come to my house tonight." Okay, I think we've got time for the next chapter. This is quite confusing. Yeah, but I'm sure it will clear up. Okay, 7 of spades. My eyes were sore after spelling my way letter by letter through this long... Oh, we're back hands now, okay? Spelling my way letter by letter through this long section in the sticky bum book. The letters were so tiny that I sometimes had to stop and wonder whether I was also making a little bit up myself. I sat for a while, staring at the high mountain tops we passed, thinking about Albert, who'd lost his mother and who'd had a father who liked his drink. After a while, Dad said, "We're getting close to the famous St. Gothard Tunnel. I think it cuts right through the big mountain range you see ahead." He told me that the St. Gothard Tunnel was the world's longest road tunnel. It was more than 16 kilometres long and had been open only a few years. But before that, for more than 100 years, there had been a railway tunnel, and before that, monks and other travellers had taken the St. Gothard Pass on their way between Italy and Germany. "So there have been people here before us," he concluded. The next moment we were inside the long tunnel. The trip through the tunnel took almost a quarter of an hour. On the other side we passed a little town called Airolo. Oloria, I said. It was a kind of game I played in the car all the way from Denmark. I read all the names and road signs backwards. Right. To see if they hid a secret word or something. Sometimes I was luckier than others. Roma, for example, became Amor, and I thought that was rather fitting. Oloria wasn't too bad either. It sounded like the name of a fairy tale country. If I squinted my eyes a little, it was as though I was driving through this country now. We drove down into a valley with small farms and stone walls. We soon crossed a river called Ticino, and when Dad saw it, his eyes began to water. That hadn't happened since we strolled along the docks in Hamburg. He braked sharply, pulled off the road. He jumped out of the car and stood pointing down at the river running through the steep-sided valley. By the time I'd got out, he'd already managed to light a cigarette. "We've reached the sea at last, my boy. I can smell the tar and the seaweed." Dad was always coming out with remarks like this, but nevertheless, this time I was scared he'd finally flipped. What particularly worried me was that he had said nothing else. It was as though he had nothing on his mind but to make it clear that we had reached the sea. I knew we were still in Switzerland, which had no coastline, and even though I hadn't a clue about geography, the high mountainsides were solid evidence that we were a long way from the sea. "Are you tired?" I asked. "Nope," he said, pointing down to the river again. "But I'm afraid I haven't told you much about the boat traffic in Central Europe, and I'm going to do that right away." I must have looked as though I'd fallen from the moon, because he had added, "Relax, Hans Thomas. There aren't any pirates here." He pointed at the mountains and continued, "We've just gone through the St. Gothard Massif. Many of Europe's longest rivers flow from here. The Rhine collects its first drops here. The source of the Rhine is also, the source of the Rhone is also here, as is the Ticino's, which joins the Great Po further downstream before running out into the Adriatic Sea. It began to dawn on me why he'd suddenly started to talk about the sea. But to confuse me even more, he said, I said the source of the Rhone was here. He pointed to the mountains again. That river flows through Geneva and down through France, before it eventually splits into the Mediterranean a few miles west of Marseille. Then there's the Rhine. It flows through Germany and Holland before it eventually empties into the North Sea. But there are many other rivers as well, you know, which drink their first gulps up here in the Alps. So, do boats sail along these rivers? I asked. I thought I'd stay one step ahead of him. Oh, you can be sure of that, my boy. But they don't just sail along the rivers, they sail between them too. He lit himself another cigarette, and once again I wondered whether he was totally out of his mind. Sometimes I worried that the alcohol was corroding his brain. For example, if you sail along the Rhine, he said, in a way you are sailing along the Rhone, the Seine, and the Lura. Sorry, that was my TV come back on. And along many other important rivers for that matter. In this way, you have access to all the great large city ports of the North Sea, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Mediterranean. This is quite long, isn't it? But aren't there high mountains separating these rivers? I asked. Yes, Dad continued, and mountains are really perfectly all right as long as you can sail between them. What are you talking about? I said, interrupting him. Sometimes I got irritated when he started to talk in riddles. Quite understand. Canals, he said. Didn't you know that you can sail from the Baltic to the Black Sea without being up near either the Atlantic Ocean or the Mediterranean? I just shook my head in despair. You end up in the Caspian Sea. In other words, in the heart of Asia, he whispered excitedly. Is that true? Yep, it's as true as the St. Gothard Tunnel. It's amazing. I stood looking down at the river, and now I thought I, too, could smell the faint tang of tar and seaweed. What do you learn at school, Hans Thomas? Dad asked. To sit still, I replied. It's so difficult that we spend years learning to do it. Okay, but do you think you'd have sat still if the teacher had told you about the sea routes in Europe? Probably, I said. Yes, quite sure. And with that, the cigarette stop was over. We drove on, following the Ticino River. The first place we passed was Bellinzona, a large town with 3 huge fortresses from the Middle Ages. After Dad had given a little lecture on the Crusades, he said, You know, I'm very interested in outer space, Hans Thomas. Well, I'm particularly interested in planets. Most of all, living planets. I didn't say anything. Both he and I knew he was interested in that kind of thing. Did you know, he continued, that a mysterious planet has just been discovered where millions of intelligent beings are loafing around on 2 legs, peering out over the planet through a pair of bright lenses? I had to admit that this was completely new to me. The little planet is held together by a complicated network of tracks where these clever guys constantly roll around in colourful wagons. Is that true? Yes, it is. On this planet, these mysterious creatures have also built enormous buildings, which are more than 100 stories tall. And underneath those constructions, they've dug long tunnels, which they can flit around in electric things moving on rails. Are you quite sure? I asked. Yes, quite sure. But why have I never heard of this planet? Well, Dad said, first of all, it was discovered only recently, and second, I fear that I am the only one who has discovered it. Where is it then? At this point, Dad stepped on the brake and pulled off the road. Here, he said, and slapped his palm down on the dashboard. This is the remarkable planet, Hans Thomas, and we are those intelligent guys rolling around in a red Fiat. I sat for a few seconds sulking because he'd fooled me. But then it occurred to me how incredible this planet is, so I forgave him. People would have gone absolutely wild if the astronomers had discovered another living planet, Dad concluded. They just don't let themselves be amazed by their own. He sat for a long time without saying anything, so I took the opportunity to read some more of the Sticky Bun book. It wasn't easy to separate all the bakers indoor from each other, but I soon understood that Ludwig was the one who had written the Sticky Bun book, and Albert was the one who had told him about the time he was a boy and went to visit Baker Hans. Okay. Oh, I so want this book to get going like I remember it. Oh, it will. Okay. Next we've got Eight of Spades, and it's reading the Sticky Bun book again. Okay. Love you loads. See you soon. Mwah.